In this video, I'm going to show you 3 different methods of putting in a lifeline. Each method has its pros and cons, and I'm sure there's other methods to do this as well, but these are the 3 most common ways that I hear. The first may or may not be the method of choice, but I'll show it anyway. It's to take a really small gauge needle. This is a size 1, but I would actually recommend a 0 if you have it, or a 00. The thinner the better. And you would actually use this needle as your lifeline. So you would take your stitches and weave the needle under each stitch, making sure that you don't put it under your stitch markers, or that stitch marker will never come off. And then you pull your work onto the cable and you just leave it. And then you continue knitting the next row so that you're just leaving that cable in place all the way around. Now, the pros to that are if you make a mistake and you need to rip back, your work is already on a cable and you can just start knitting off of the cable. The cons is that your stitches that have been measured on your needle to gauge are now bigger, and so you may have a row of stitches that look a little bit stretched out. Since we're doing a lace piece, that probably doesn't matter quite as much, but it's something to consider. So that's not the method I'm going to use today. The next most common method is to use a tapestry needle, and it's helpful to use really thin yarn or cotton thread that doesn't pill as you move it through your work, or doesn't leave little tufts of color behind when you pull it out. But it is helpful to do it in a brighter color, or a color you can see. And that works just like the tapestry needle method, where you're going to take your needle, and I think it actually works better to do it when your work is on the cable, not on the needle tip, because it gives you a little more space. And you're going to insert the needle through each stitch, but not through your stitch markers. You definitely don't want to do that. And I'm on a row here where the next row I would be purling back across my lace. So the best place to insert this is actually after a purl back row, because then you don't have the yarn overs to contend with. And so if I were doing this for real, I would do it on the other side coming back. But if you are in a pickle and you need to put it in here, then you would just go under the yarn over, just like the path of your cable. And you can pull your thread through and then come back and do another 5 or 6 stitches. But you're following the path of the cable. So if it goes under a yarn over, you go under a yarn over. If it goes through a decrease, you go through a decrease. Just don't go through your stitch markers. Then, if you find yourself having to go back to this point, I'm going to stop right there. Then all you would do is take your stitches off of their needle, like so. You'd rip back until you get to the point where your marker, or sorry, your lifeline is holding it, and then you just put your stitches back on your needle, using the lifeline as a guide. And then you can pull your lifeline out. The third most popular method, and then the pros and cons for this, really the only con is if you use yarn that leaves a trail behind when you pull it out. That's frustrating. So make sure that you pick something thin, something that isn't going to fray or leave a mess when you pull it out. And I can't think of any other cons Maybe if you accidentally go through a stitch marker, that's a con, because then you can't get your stitch marker out without cutting it. So the third method is if you use interchangeable needles, you can see that there is one hole here that is used to attach the cable to this post, and then a second hole where you attach your needle tip to the cable needle, and then you insert this little stick of steel, and that gives you the leverage to tighten your needle tip. So I've taken some sewing thread and just woven it, or just put it through that second hole, the one that goes all the way around. And I've got a length of thread longer than my project. Now, be careful what kind of thread you use, because you don't want something that's going to break. It needs to be strong sewing thread, but you also can see it needs to be really thin so that it can fit through that hole. Then when you're about to work a purl back row, which I am, I'm going to take my needle tip that has the thread on it, and I'm just going to knit a row, or in this case follow the pattern, which is to knit the edges. We are going to have to forego our markers, because once again, if you use your markers now, they will get put on the lifeline. So that's just the one trick to this. Okay. So then just by knitting all the way across, you can very, very carefully, you can see that thread has been run all the way through my stitches. So then I just doubled my thread over, so I can take one length of this thread out, and I can take it out of my needle. And then as I keep knitting, make sure you don't knit up the thread as you go back. But now my lifeline is placed, and if I needed to put those stitches back on the needles, I could do so if I had to rip back. So those are the three methods for putting in a lifeline. I'm sure there's others, but those are the three most common, and I hope that was helpful for you.